The first week of September always carried a certain heaviness for Claire Mitchell. The Indiana heat was beginning to ease, the air crisp in the mornings, yet her days remained tangled in the routine of lesson plans, grading essays, and trying to hide the loneliness that trailed her since the divorce. It had been almost a year since she had signed the papers, yet every time she returned to her modest brick house on the edge of town, the silence echoed louder than before. That Tuesday, when she pulled the stack of mail from her small metal mailbox, she expected nothing more than bills and grocery coupons. Instead, there it was, an envelope thicker and heavier than the rest, stamped with the name of a law firm in Indianapolis. For a moment, her breath caught. She turned it over in her hands, brows furrowing at the formal seal. She didn't know any lawyers. She didn't know anyone in Indianapolis. She set the envelope aside at first, forcing herself to focus on the everyday, helping her daughter Emily with algebra homework, preparing dinner from what little was left in the fridge, and later, collapsing on the couch with a cup of tea. But that envelope sat there on the table, its presence gnawing at her until she finally tore it open. The letter inside was short and formal, informing her that she had been named in the last will and testament of her late Uncle Raymond. Claire blinked, rereading the lines as if they might change on the second or third pass. Uncle Raymond? The same man she had seen only once at a family reunion years ago, who had lived mostly in seclusion, rumored to spend his days tinkering with wrecked cars at his junkyard. The letter stated she had inherited the property, nothing more. She dropped the paper back on the table, a humorless laugh escaping her lips. "A junkyard," she muttered. "That's just what I need." Emily looked up from the kitchen counter, her pencil hovering above her notebook. "What's funny?" "Not funny," Claire said quickly, pushing the letter aside. "Just complicated." Her daughter studied her with the perceptive eyes of a 14-year-old who had grown far too mature through the turbulence of divorce. "Complicated how?" "It's nothing worth talking about," Claire replied, forcing a smile. "Finish your homework." But when Emily went back to scribbling equations, Claire leaned back in her chair, staring at the letter. She felt a mix of irritation and disbelief. Life had already been difficult enough. Her salary as a middle school English teacher barely covered the mortgage, and David, her ex-husband, never failed to remind her of her financial shortcomings whenever they argued about child support. And now this, an inheritance of rusting metal and decayed machinery. Her mind spiraled with questions. Why her? Why not another relative? Was there some hidden string attached? She knew people would laugh. The thought of walking into the teacher's lounge and hearing whispers about the divorced teacher inheriting a pile of junk made her stomach twist. Still, curiosity flickered beneath her skepticism. For a long time she sat in silence, the ticking kitchen clock marking the minutes. At last, she folded the letter neatly and slipped it into her purse. She told herself she'd deal with it later, when she had the time, when she had the energy, when life wasn't pressing in on her from every direction. But deep down, she sensed that ignoring it wouldn't make it go away. And perhaps, just perhaps, opening that envelope had set something in motion that would change everything. Before we continue with Claire's journey, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more powerful stories that remind us how life can take unexpected turns. That night, as she lay awake in bed listening to the faint hum of traffic from the highway, the letter played in her mind like a stubborn melody. She told herself it was ridiculous to even think about. It was a junkyard, nothing more. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something waited beyond the words on that page, something her tired heart was not ready to believe in, but couldn't entirely dismiss. And so, the letter remained tucked in her purse, resting quietly like a secret, waiting for the day she could no longer ignore it. The morning bell at Jefferson Middle School echoed through the crowded hallways, and Claire Mitchell adjusted the stack of essays in her arms. She moved carefully, weaving past lockers slamming shut, and students jostling each other with the careless energy of early adolescence. Her shoulders ached from the weight of the papers and from the heavier burden she carried quietly every day. Teaching had once been her passion, but lately it felt like survival. Inside her classroom, rows of desks stood slightly askew, pencil marks etched into their surfaces like scars of restless years. Posters of classic novels hung on the walls, faded at the edges from time and sun. Claire took a deep breath before greeting her first group of students. "Good morning, everyone. Let's settle in. Today we're going to talk about symbolism in To Kill a Mockingbird." She saw the usual mix of reactions: a few eager faces, several bored stares, and two boys whispering in the back who never seemed to stop. She pressed forward, guiding them through themes and questions, trying to spark some kind of interest. Teaching required a balance of patience and energy, both of which felt in short supply lately. When the last bell rang, she collapsed into her desk chair, rubbing her temples. A knock on the open door made her look up. Mrs. Walker, the principal, stepped inside with her familiar warm smile. "Claire, you survived another Monday," Mrs. Walker teased lightly. "Barely," Claire replied, managing a small laugh. The principal's expression softened. "I know things haven't been easy for you, but I want you to remember you're doing important work here. The students notice, even if they don't show it." Claire nodded, grateful for the encouragement, though the words felt like a fragile thread holding her together. Later that afternoon in the teacher's lounge, the atmosphere was less kind. Two younger teachers sat near the coffee machine, whispering just loud enough to be overheard. "She's still driving that old sedan. Must be tough after the divorce," one said, pretending not to notice Claire at the table. "Yeah," the other replied with a smirk. "And now I hear she's dealing with some kind of inheritance mess, like that's going to fix anything." Claire kept her eyes on the essay she was grading, her pen pressing harder into the paper than necessary. She refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction, but her chest tightened. Gossip traveled quickly in small towns, and her name was often at the center of it. That evening, when she picked up Emily from soccer practice, her daughter immediately sensed her mood. "Rough day?" Emily asked, sliding into the passenger seat. Claire forced a smile. "Just the usual. Nothing new." Emily studied her mother with a mix of concern and teenage frankness. "You're stronger than they think, Mum. Don't let them get to you." Her words pierced through the exhaustion, offering a spark of comfort. Claire reached over, squeezed her daughter's hand and whispered, "Thank you." Driving home under the fading orange sky, Claire thought about the letter still tucked inside her purse. She had ignored it for days, burying herself in lesson plans and responsibilities, but the thought of that inheritance lingered like an unfinished sentence. Was it worth investigating, or would it only bring more judgment and ridicule? The tension between her professional life, her personal struggles, and the mystery of the inheritance weighed heavily. She had been surviving on routine, afraid of what change might demand from her, yet something told her that ignoring the matter forever wasn't an option. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the house looked lonelier than ever, its porch light flickering against the dusk. Inside, she and Emily prepared a simple dinner, laughter surfacing occasionally between them, reminders that even in difficult times, they still had each other. But when Claire went to bed, the silence pressed in again. She thought about the whispers in the lounge, the quiet encouragement from Mrs. Walker, and Emily's faith in her. She realized that somewhere beneath her fatigue was a question that wouldn't leave her alone. What if this inheritance wasn't just a joke? The thought unsettled her, yet it carried a strange pull, one that would not let go. The following Saturday morning, Claire finally gave in to the nagging curiosity that had been eating at her since the letter arrived. With Emily at a friend's house for the weekend, she had no excuses left to postpone. She slipped the folded letter into her bag, grabbed her car keys, and set off on the county road leading to the outskirts of town. The farther she drove, the more familiar houses gave way to open fields and empty lots. A thin layer of mist clung to the ground, and the September air carried the smell of damp soil and gasoline from a nearby station. After nearly half an hour, she spotted the crooked sign with peeling white paint. Raymond's Auto Salvage. The letters were barely legible, but they marked her destination. Pulling up to the gate, Claire's heart sank. The property was even worse than she had imagined. Piles of rusted car parts were stacked haphazardly along the fence, their sharp edges catching the morning light. Old tires leaned like tired soldiers against the chain-link barrier. Grass and weeds had grown tall, swallowing the edges of the gravel path. The junkyard looked less like a business and more like a graveyard for machines long forgotten. She parked at the entrance and stepped out cautiously, the crunch of gravel under her shoes the only sound. A dog barked in the distance, low and rough, though she couldn't see it. For a moment, Claire thought about getting back into her car and driving away, pretending this had never happened. But something in her chest urged her forward. As she lingered at the gate, the sound of a door slamming broke the silence. A broad-shouldered man in grease-stained overalls emerged from a small shack near the edge of the yard. His face was weathered, his hands still blackened with oil despite the rag he carried. He squinted at her, then smirked. "Well, if it isn't the new queen of scrap metal," he called out, his voice carrying a mix of amusement and mockery. Claire stiffened. "Excuse me?" He walked closer, wiping his hands on the rag. "Word travels fast. I'm Joe. I run repairs down the road. Everybody knows you inherited Raymond's pile of junk. Guess you came to admire your empire." Heat rose to Claire's cheeks. She hated being the subject of gossip, hated even more the way his smirk made her feel like a fool. "I'm just here to take a look," she said firmly. Joe chuckled. "Well, you're looking at it. Rust, rot, and headaches. Not exactly the kind of thing you show off to friends." Her instinct was to fire back, to defend herself, but instead she turned her eyes back to the wreckage. He wasn't wrong. It looked worthless. But she couldn't shake the sense that there was more here than anyone cared to see. "Did you know my uncle well?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Joe shrugged. "Knew him enough? Quiet man. Kept to himself. Always tinkering with something, never much for company. Folks stopped asking him to church potlucks years ago. But he was smart. Too smart to waste his life out here, if you ask me." His tone softened just slightly, but the smirk returned before long. "Guess the apple didn't fall far from the tree. You Mitchells always did know how to pick a dead end." Claire felt a sting sharper than she expected. Without answering, she turned back toward her car, her pulse quickening. She hated giving him the satisfaction of seeing her rattle, but she needed to leave before the weight of his words cut deeper. As she drove away, the junkyard shrinking in her rearview mirror, a mixture of anger and shame swirled inside her. She had wanted to prove Joe wrong, to show she wasn't just a joke, but instead she left with more doubts than before. Still, one thing was clear. The inheritance wasn't going to be simple. It wasn't just about property, it was about reputation, resilience, and the choice of whether she would let others define her story. And that decision, she knew, was only beginning to take shape. Claire waited a full week before she finally dialed the number listed in the inheritance letter. The junkyard visit had left her embarrassed and shaken, but she couldn't let the matter end there. Too many questions remained unanswered. One late afternoon, after grading a mountain of essays and forcing herself through another lonely dinner, she picked up the phone and arranged an appointment with the law firm in Indianapolis. The drive into the city was long, her old sedan humming along the interstate, while the landscape shifted from quiet farm fields to tall buildings and crowded exits. By the time she pulled into the parking garage, her palms were slick with nerves. She hated offices, hated the formality of suits and reception desks, but this was unavoidable. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive coffee. A receptionist greeted her, then led her into a spacious office lined with bookshelves. Behind a large oak desk sat a man in his late 40s, his dark suit crisp, his expression calm but approachable. "Miss Mitchell," he said, rising to shake her hand. "I'm Mark Reynolds." "Thank you for coming." His voice was steady, reassuring in a way that caught her off guard. Claire took the seat he gestured to, smoothing her skirt nervously. "I suppose you already know why I'm here," she said. Mark nodded, sliding a folder across the desk. "Yes, your Uncle Raymond left instructions regarding his estate, and you are his sole beneficiary." She frowned. "Estate?" "That's a generous word for what I saw. It's a junkyard. That's all it is." Mark leaned back slightly, his lips curving into something between a smile and a secret. "That's what most people believe. But Raymond's property was larger than it appeared. The junkyard was only the front portion. What you inherited extends far beyond the rusting cars." Claire blinked, uncertain she had heard him correctly. "What do you mean beyond?" He opened a map, carefully unfolding it across the desk. His finger traced a thick boundary line that stretched far past the area she had visited. The salvage yard covers about 10 acres, but in reality the deed shows over 100 acres of land. And here, he tapped the shaded area, stands a house, or rather a mansion. The word seemed absurd. Claire shook her head. There must be some mistake. I've never heard anything about this. Mark's expression didn't waver. Your uncle valued his privacy. He kept the mansion hidden, quite literally, behind the land most people associated with him. I've reviewed the records myself. It's all legal and it's all yours. Claire's heart pounded as she stared at the map. The junkyard had already been enough to stir ridicule. A mansion? Acres of woodland? The thought was overwhelming, bordering on impossible. I don't understand, she whispered. Why me? He barely knew me. Mark folded his hands on the desk. Sometimes people leave things behind not because of close ties, but because they believe the recipient might make use of them. Perhaps your uncle saw something in you, or perhaps he simply wanted someone in the family to have it. Her thoughts spiraled. She imagined the teacher's lounge whispers if they discovered this, imagined David's mocking laugh. A mansion, falling apart or not, was more responsibility than she could bear. But alongside the fear, a spark of something else flickered, a pull of possibility, of mystery. Mark studied her carefully. You don't have to decide anything right now, but I do encourage you to see it for yourself before making any choices. Claire exhaled, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. A mansion, she repeated, still tasting disbelief. Yes, he said quietly, and a story you have yet to uncover. As she left the office, clutching the folder with maps and documents, the city lights flickering outside, she felt the weight of her life shift. Whatever she thought she knew about her inheritance had just been rewritten. And she couldn't escape the sense that stepping through that gate again would change her forever. The following weekend, Claire convinced Emily to come with her. She didn't want to face whatever lay beyond the junkyard fence alone, and despite her doubts, she sensed that her daughter's presence might anchor her in ways she couldn't manage on her own. The morning sun rose pale over the Indiana fields as they drove, the road narrowing into a cracked two-lane path bordered by weeds and wildflowers. Emily leaned against the passenger window, earbuds dangling around her neck. So, Emily said, breaking the silence, are we seriously going to see some old house? Or is this another one of those wild goose chases where we end up wasting a Saturday? Claire shot her daughter a look, though she couldn't suppress a half smile. It's real. The lawyer showed me the map. I need to see it with my own eyes. And honestly, I'd like you there too. Emily shrugged, feigning indifference. But beneath the casual tone there was curiosity. She wanted to see what this mystery was about just as much as her mother did. When they reached the junkyard entrance, the familiar sight of twisted metal and rust greeted them. But this time, Claire didn't stop at the gate. She followed the map Mark had given her, steering down a narrow gravel lane that veered off to the right. It was overgrown, branches scraping against the car, weeds brushing the tires. "Mom, are you sure this is safe?" Emily asked, her voice wavering between concern and intrigue. "No," Claire admitted honestly, her grip tightening on the wheel. "But we're doing it anyway." After what felt like forever, the path opened into a wide clearing. Claire slowed to a stop, her breath catching in her throat. Before them stretched a long driveway lined with trees, their branches arching overhead like forgotten guardians. At the end of the path, partially hidden by ivy and shadows, stood a mansion. It was larger than anything Claire had ever imagined, its structure imposing despite the years of neglect. Tall windows, some broken, stared blankly across the grounds. The once grand porch sagged in places, the wood weathered grey. Ivy climbed the brick walls in twisting vines, and the roof bore patches where tiles had slipped away. Emily's eyes widened. "Oh my gosh! It looks like something out of a movie." Claire stepped out of the car slowly, her shoes crunching against gravel. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and old wood, heavy with a silence that pressed against her ears. She walked forward, Emily trailing close behind. "This was his?" Emily whispered. Claire nodded, her throat tight. All of it. They reached the base of the porch steps. Paint peeled in long strips, and one of the boards creaked dangerously under her weight. She hesitated, staring up at the looming doorway. The carved wooden doors, though chipped and weathered, still held remnants of elegance. Emily glanced at her mother, a spark of excitement lighting her face. "We could fix it up. Imagine living here." Claire's heart twisted. She wanted to believe it was possible, but all she could see were the broken windows, the sagging roof, the overwhelming expense. She pressed her palm against the doorframe, the rough wood grounding her in reality. "Emily," she said softly, "this place is more responsibility than we could ever handle. It's falling apart." "Yeah, but—" Emily's voice softened too, carrying hope Claire hadn't expected. "It's ours. Doesn't that mean something?" The words struck deep, more than Emily could know. For so long, Claire had felt defined by what had been taken from her, her marriage, her sense of stability, her confidence. Standing here, looking at the neglected grandeur her uncle had left behind, she wondered if maybe this was her chance to redefine herself. But the weight of it pressed hard, filling her chest with both awe and fear. As they stood together in the silence of the clearing, Claire realized this was only the beginning. By Monday morning, the news had already spread across town. Claire wasn't sure who started it. Maybe Joe with his smug grin, maybe one of the clerks at the county office. But by the time she stepped into Jefferson Middle School, whispers floated behind her like shadows. She walked through the hallway, clutching a pile of novels for her 7th graders, forcing herself not to meet the curious stares. A few colleagues offered polite nods, but she could feel the undercurrent. People knew she had inherited more than just a junkyard. At lunch, she tried to retreat to a quiet corner of the teacher's lounge, but even there, gossip hung in the air. "I heard the place is huge," said Mrs. Peterson, the math teacher, stirring her soup. "A whole estate just sitting there, and she didn't even know about it." Mr. Lee chuckled. "Can you imagine? Some people just get lucky. Not all of us have mysterious uncles leaving mansions behind." Claire tightened her grip on her sandwich, her appetite vanishing. She kept her eyes on the table, pretending not to listen, but the words stung. To them it was entertainment. To her it was an anchor dragging her deeper into doubt. That evening, when she stopped by Miller's Diner to pick up dinner for herself and Emily, the gossip followed her there. The diner, with its checkered floors and worn booths, was the heart of town chatter. As she waited at the counter, she caught 2 older men murmuring by the window. "Mitchell's girl got the Raymond estate," one said, his voice low but clear enough to carry. "Estate, huh?" the other scoffed. "More like a money pit. Place has been rotting for decades. She'll lose her shirt trying to fix it up." Claire turned away, cheeks burning, pretending to study the pies displayed behind glass, but the words lodged deep. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about her life, her choices, her worth. Back at home, Emily noticed her mother's silence as they sat down with their takeout. "You're upset," Emily said simply. Claire sighed, pushing her fries around the plate. "People are talking. About the estate, about me. They think I'm foolish for even setting foot out there." Emily leaned forward, her eyes steady. "Who cares what they think? They don't know you, they don't know us." Claire gave a weary smile. "Easier said than done. I've lived in this town my whole life. People here remember every mistake you make." "But maybe they'll remember what you do right too," Emily countered. Her daughter's confidence tugged at her heart, but it didn't erase the weight pressing on her shoulders. The whispers, the sideways glances, the half-smiles, they were everywhere. It wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about her place in this town, about whether she would always be the woman people pitied, the divorced teacher struggling to hold things together. Later that week, she sat alone on her porch after Emily had gone to bed, the night air cool against her skin. Crickets chirped in the grass, and the streetlight buzzed softly. She thought about her uncle, about the crumbling mansion waiting behind the junkyard. Was it a gift or a curse? She could sell the land, rid herself of the burden, and quiet the gossip. But a small, stubborn part of her wondered if giving up would only prove them right. The voices of the town swirled in her mind, but Emily's words lingered too. "Maybe they'll remember what you do right." Claire sat there until the porch light flickered, her chest heavy with uncertainty. She didn't have answers yet, only choices. And she knew the next step would test not just her patience but her strength. Claire returned to the estate later that week, this time alone. The drive through the narrow gravel lane felt heavier than before, as if the trees themselves leaned closer, whispering doubts into her ears. When she parked in front of the mansion, the reality of what she faced struck harder than ever. In the clear light of day, the floors were impossible to ignore. The roofline sagged in several places, shingles scattered across the ground like broken teeth. Mold streaked the once grand walls, and vines crept through cracks in the brick. Windows were missing glass entirely, their frames hollow and weathered. The porch boards groaned under her weight, and when she pushed open the front door, the smell of damp wood and decay rolled out like a wave. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust. Cobwebs hung in corners, and water stains spread across the ceilings. In the grand hallway, the marble floor was chipped and dull. The staircase that once must have inspired awe now looked treacherous, one step cracked, another sagging. Claire pressed a hand to her forehead, whispering, "What on earth am I supposed to do with this?" That question followed her when she met with a local contractor 2 days later. He walked through the rooms with a clipboard, his boots crunching against debris. He muttered figures under his breath, shook his head often, and finally handed her an estimate that made her chest tighten. "You're looking at a 6-figure project minimum," he said, not unkindly. "Roof alone could sink you. Plumbing's ancient, electrical's not up to code, and that's before you even think about cosmetic work. Honestly, you'd save yourself a lot of money and heartache by tearing it down." Claire clutched the paper, her stomach sinking. "Thank you for your time," she murmured, though the words felt hollow. Back in her car, she stared at the estimate until the numbers blurred. 6 figures. She barely scraped by on her teacher's salary. Even with careful budgeting, she couldn't afford more than small repairs, let alone a massive restoration. Her next stop was the county office, where another obstacle waited. A clerk with tired eyes and a clipped tone informed her that several years of unpaid property taxes had accumulated. "Altogether, with interest, it comes to just under $20,000, the clerk said, tapping her keyboard. "Payment arrangements are possible, but until it's resolved, the property is technically at risk for seizure." 20,000. Claire felt her knees weaken. She signed the paperwork for a payment plan, but the weight of it nearly crushed her. That night she sat at the kitchen table with Emily, trying to hide the despair in her voice as they ate spaghetti. "Is it really that bad?" Emily asked gently. Claire hesitated. She didn't want to unload the full truth, but her daughter deserved honesty. "It's worse than I thought. The house needs more work than we could ever afford, and there are taxes I didn't know about." Emily twirled her fork, her brows furrowing. "So, what happens now?" Claire forced a small smile. "I don't know yet." The next day, she ran into David outside the grocery store. He leaned against his shiny SUV, arms crossed, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Heard about your little castle," he said. "Bet it's falling apart. You never did have a talent for practical decisions." Claire clenched her jaw, refusing to let him see her falter. "It's not your concern." David chuckled. "You're right, but don't say I didn't warn you when it eats you alive." As she drove home, anger boiled beneath her despair. The estate wasn't just a crumbling mansion, it was a test, one everyone expected her to fail. And though she felt overwhelmed, something inside her whispered that walking away would mean letting them all be right. Claire woke up that Saturday with a heaviness pressing on her chest. The numbers from the contractor's estimate and the tax bill echoed in her head like a drumbeat she couldn't silence. Every rational thought screamed at her to give up, to call the developer, who had already left a message offering to buy the property. Yet when she pictured signing away the estate, a knot formed in her stomach. She drove back out to the junkyard, determined to take one more look before making any decisions. The morning air was cool, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. As she stood by the gate, hands on her hips, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Well, look who's back." She turned to see Joe, the mechanic, wiping his hands on a rag. His smirk was still there, but softer this time. "Don't start," Claire warned, though her voice lacked its usual bite. Joe raised his hands in mock surrender. Easy, teacher. I wasn't going to say anything. Just figured you could use a hand. She blinked, skeptical. A hand. Why? Because, he said, glancing toward the overgrown driveway, I got the equipment to clear some of that mess, and you clearly don't. Besides, Raymond wasn't a bad guy. He just kept to himself. If he left this place to you, maybe there's something worth saving. Claire studied him, torn between suspicion and gratitude. Joe wasn't the type to hand out favors, yet there was a sincerity in his tone she hadn't expected. After a moment she sighed. Fine, but I'm not paying you. I don't have money for this. Joe chuckled. Relax. I'm not sending you a bill. Call it neighborly duty. Together they walked the path toward the mansion. Joe pointed out spots where the trees had overgrown dangerously close to the roofline, explaining how trimming them would prevent further damage. He noted the foundation cracks, muttering about possible fixes. Unlike the contractor, who had rattled off impossible figures, Joe spoke in practical terms as if the problems, though daunting, weren't entirely hopeless. Later that week, she visited Mark Reynolds at his office to discuss the tax issue. He listened intently, his calm demeanor easing some of her panic. Claire, he said, folding his hands, you're overwhelmed because you're looking at the full mountain. Don't. Take it one piece at a time. I can help negotiate the tax payments. As for repairs, there may be grants available for historical properties. It's worth researching before you decide to sell. His voice carried a quiet conviction that steadied her. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. Everyone keeps telling me to give up, that it's too much. Mark's eyes met hers, steady and kind. Maybe that's exactly why you shouldn't. His words stayed with her long after she left the office. At school, Mrs. Walker noticed the exhaustion in Claire's face and pulled her aside. You look like you're carrying the world on your shoulders, the principal said gently. Claire offered a weak smile. Feels about right. Don't forget, Mrs. Walker added, squeezing her arm, you've carried harder things, you're still standing. Whatever this is, I believe you'll find a way. The unexpected support from different corners of her life began to form a fragile net beneath her. For the first time since she opened that letter, she felt she wasn't entirely alone. That night, as she and Emily sat on the porch eating sandwiches, Claire shared what Mark had told her about grants and possibilities. So you're not selling? Emily asked, her voice hopeful. Claire looked out at the darkened street, the weight in her chest easing just slightly. Not yet. I'm starting to think maybe it's worth trying. The words felt daring, like stepping onto a tightrope. But instead of fear, she felt the faint stirrings of resolve. The mansion seemed quieter the day Claire returned with Emily, as though the air itself held back, waiting for them to enter. Armed with flashlights and dust masks, they stepped into the grand hallway. Dust floated in the sunbeams that pierced through cracks in the boarded-up windows. This place gives me goosebumps, Emily muttered, her light sweeping over the faded wallpaper. Claire managed a small laugh. It's just old. Nothing to be afraid of. Yet inside, her pulse quickened. She couldn't shake the feeling that each creak of the floorboards carried the memory of the man who had lived here in solitude. They wandered from room to room, peering into spaces filled with broken furniture, water-damaged rugs, and stacks of boxes. Eventually, in the far corner of the library, Emily tugged at a cabinet door that stuck halfway open. With a grunt, she forced it wide, revealing a hidden shelf stacked with journals bound in cracked leather. "Mum, look," she said, excitement cutting through the gloom. Claire carefully lifted one of the books, brushing off a layer of dust. The handwriting inside was unmistakably Raymond's, angular, deliberate, and heavy with ink. She sank into a nearby chair, its upholstery torn, and began to read aloud. September 14th, 1989. I can't bring myself to leave this place, though it feels more like a prison than a home. I failed her, and I failed myself. The walls keep the truth, and maybe that's where it belongs. Emily frowned. Failed who? Claire flipped through more pages, her brow furrowing deeper with each entry. The journals painted a portrait of a man consumed by regret. Raymond wrote about arguments with his wife, a marriage that had dissolved under the strain of secrets and pride. He described watching opportunities slip through his fingers, turning inward until isolation became his only companion. One entry stopped Claire cold. "She left because I couldn't let go of my pride. I thought silence would protect me, but it only destroyed us. Now the estate rots the way I've rotted inside." Claire closed the book, her throat tight. She could almost hear the echoes of his bitterness in the cracked plaster walls. Emily sat beside her, curiosity lighting her face. "He sounds sad." "Lonely?" "Yes," Claire whispered, clutching the journal. "And angry. But underneath it all, I think he wanted someone to understand him." For the rest of the afternoon, they sifted through the journals, piecing together fragments of Raymond's life. They found letters addressed to relatives who never responded, sketches of repairs he had planned but never finished, even photographs of the estate in its glory days, gardens blooming, windows gleaming, Raymond himself standing proudly at the front steps with his wife, a woman with dark eyes and a gentle smile. Claire traced the photograph with her finger. He had everything, and still he let it slip away. Emily tilted her head. "Kind of like Dad, huh?" The comparison cut deep. Claire looked at her daughter, surprised by her bluntness, but she couldn't deny the truth in it. David had walked away, consumed by his own pride, leaving behind the wreckage of a family. And here she was, left to pick up the pieces, just as her uncle had once failed to do. That night back at home, Claire sat at the kitchen table long after Emily had gone to bed. The journals lay stacked beside her, their weight more than just paper and ink. They were warnings, lessons written in sorrow. She whispered to herself, "I won't let this be me. I won't rot in regret." For the first time since inheriting the estate, she felt a strange kinship with Raymond. His mistakes mirrored her own fears, but his words also lit a quiet fire within her. If he had left this burden to her, maybe it wasn't punishment. Maybe it was a chance to choose differently. And deep inside, she knew she had to. The journals had left Claire restless. For nights she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying Raymond's regrets alongside her own. But the weight of reality pressed harder than memories. No matter what lessons the past carried, she still faced bills, taxes, and a house threatening to collapse on itself. One grey Tuesday afternoon, she sat across from a developer at a local cafe. He was neatly dressed, his smile smooth and practiced. "Ms. Mitchell," he began, sliding a folder toward her, "we're prepared to make a fair cash offer on the property. We'd handle the taxes, the demolition, everything. You'd walk away free and clear." Claire opened the folder. The number was large, larger than anything she'd ever seen attached to her name. It would pay off her mortgage, cover Emily's future tuition, and still leave enough to breathe for once. She stared at the figure, her heart racing. "That's a lot." The developer leaned closer. "It's also realistic. That estate is a liability. Don't let sentiment drag you down." His words echoed in her chest long after she left the cafe. Practicality whispered that he was right. Selling would silence the gossip, free her from debt, and let her return to the simple life she knew. But that night, as she set the offer on the kitchen table, Emily caught sight of it. "What's that?" Claire hesitated before answering. "It's an offer to buy the estate. They'd handle everything, we'd be done with it." Emily's face fell. "You're going to sell it?" "I don't know," Claire admitted, her voice tired. "It might be the smart thing to do." Emily pushed the paper back across the table. "But it's ours, Mom. You said it yourself, it's more than just a house. It's a chance to start over. Why give that up?" The conviction in her daughter's voice startled her. Claire had expected resistance, but not this fire. It's not that simple. The repairs, the taxes, it's overwhelming. We could lose everything." Emily's eyes glistened, but her voice stayed steady. "Or we could make something of it. You're always telling me to fight for what matters. Doesn't this matter?" Claire felt her throat tighten. She wanted to say no, to insist it was just a crumbling building, but deep down, she knew Emily was right. It wasn't just about bricks and wood. It was about whether she would let fear decide her future, the way Raymond had. Later that week, she met again with Mark Reynolds. His office was warm, the soft lamplight casting steady shadows across the bookshelves. "I need your honest opinion," she told him, sliding the offer across his desk. "Should I take this and walk away?" Mark studied the paper, then looked back at her. "Claire, this is a good offer, but good doesn't mean right. What do you want?" She let out a frustrated laugh. "I don't know what I want. I'm exhausted. I'm scared. I feel like I'm standing at a crossroads and no matter which way I go, I'm going to regret it." Mark leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "You're not Raymond. His story doesn't have to be yours. If you sell, make sure it's because it's truly what you want, not because you're afraid." His words landed heavy, stirring both fear and hope. That night, Claire stood by her kitchen window, watching the street lamps flicker. The offer still lay on the table, but so did the journals, stacked neatly beside it. One represented escape. The other, a challenge. Her pulse quickened as she whispered into the quiet room, "Which mistake do I want to live with?" The choice pressed harder than ever, and she knew it wouldn't wait much longer. The letter from the developer was still sitting on Claire's table when she received another envelope. This one from the county clerk's office. Inside was a notice. A public hearing had been scheduled to discuss the future of the Raymond property. Word had spread fast, and now the town wanted to weigh in. The following Thursday evening, Claire walked into the town hall, her stomach twisting. The room buzzed with voices, the folding chairs filled with neighbors, shop owners, and church members. Some faces she recognized from the diner, others from school events. Their expressions ranged from curious to hostile. The county commissioner called the meeting to order. "We're here to discuss the property recently inherited by Ms. Claire Mitchell. There are proposals on the table, one from developers seeking commercial use and another option to preserve it as a historical site. Tonight the community will have its say." Claire sank into her chair, wishing she could disappear. But the moment the floor opened for comments, the room erupted. A man in a plaid jacket stood first. "That land is prime space for stores and housing. This town needs growth, not some crumbling relic. Selling is the sensible choice." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Then an older woman rose, her voice sharp. "Raymond's estate is part of our history. Tearing it down would erase that. We've lost too many landmarks already. It should be preserved." Applause broke out from the back rows. The room divided quickly, voices overlapping. Some shouting for progress, others for preservation. Claire sat frozen, heart pounding, until someone near the front called out, "What does she think? It's hers after all." All eyes turned to her. Heat flushed her face. She hadn't planned to speak, hadn't prepared a single word, but silence would only make things worse. Slowly she stood. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I don't know what the right answer is. I never asked for this estate. To me, it's overwhelming, too big, too broken, too much for one person to carry. But I also know it's not just mine. It's part of this town's story." The room quieted, the intensity of so many eyes pressing down on her. "I understand the need for progress," she continued. "I've lived here all my life. I know the struggles this community faces. But I also stood inside that mansion, and I saw what it used to be. It was more than walls and wood. It was a dream someone had. And maybe, just maybe, it could mean something again." Her hands trembled, but she kept her gaze steady. "I don't have all the answers. I can't promise miracles, but I do know this. I won't make a decision based on fear or on what's easiest. I'll make it based on what feels right for me, for my daughter, and maybe even for this town." For a moment the room was silent. Then voices rose again, some supportive, others skeptical. But the tone had shifted. People weren't just arguing about land anymore. They were looking at Claire differently, not as the divorce teacher with a burden she couldn't handle, but as someone standing at the center of a choice that mattered. As the meeting adjourned, Mrs. Walker approached, her smile proud. "You found your voice tonight," she said softly. Claire exhaled, relief and fear mingling. "I don't know if it was enough." "It was honest," Mrs. Walker replied. "That's more than most people manage." Walking back to her car, Claire felt drained but strangely lighter. Speaking up hadn't solved anything, but it had changed something inside her. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was running from the inheritance. She was beginning to face it head-on. And whether the town stood with her or against her, she knew the next steps would demand more courage than she had ever imagined. The morning after the town hall meeting, Claire sat at the kitchen table with Emily, sipping lukewarm coffee while her daughter spread peanut butter on toast. Her nerves from the night before still lingered, but beneath them was something steadier: resolve. Emily looked up, eyes bright. "You were amazing last night, Mum. I think people actually listened." Claire smiled faintly. "I don't know about amazing, but I didn't run away, and maybe that's something." That weekend, she drove back to the estate, determined not to let fear paralyze her anymore. To her surprise, Joe's old pickup was already parked by the gate. He was unloading tools from the bed. "What are you doing here?" she asked, stepping out of her car. "Figured I'd get a head start," he replied, not looking up. "That driveway's a mess. If we clear it, maybe you'll actually be able to see the place without worrying about branches taking your car's paint off." Claire folded her arms, suspicious but grateful. "You really don't have to do this." Joe smirked. "Relax, teacher. Think of it as community service. Besides, I get tired of fixing the same engines every day. This is a change of pace." They worked side by side, the roar of his chainsaw cutting through the silence as branches fell. Claire dragged debris into piles, her arms aching but her spirit oddly lifted. By the end of the afternoon, the driveway looked almost welcoming. Word must have spread, because the following weekend more people showed up. A group of teenagers from the high school carried trash bags and gloves. Mrs. Walker brought sandwiches and bottles of water. Even the church youth group offered to help scrub walls. At first, Claire felt awkward, as though she were imposing. But as laughter and conversation filled the air, she realized people weren't here out of pity. They were here because they wanted to be part of something bigger. Inside the mansion, progress was slow but steady. Emily and her friends scrubbed floors until the wood began to shine beneath the grime. Joe repaired the old barn door, humming tunelessly as he worked. Claire focused on the library, carefully dusting shelves and stacking the journals she had found. Each task, no matter how small, felt like reclaiming a piece of the estate's dignity. One afternoon, as they paused for lunch on the porch, Emily leaned against her mother's shoulder. "It's starting to look alive again." Claire glanced around at the freshly cleared yard, the sound of hammers and laughter drifting through the air. "Yeah," she whispered, emotion tightening her throat. "It is." Not everything went smoothly. A storm knocked loose part of the roof, undoing days of work. Mold in the basement proved stubborn, and one volunteer twisted an ankle, forcing Claire to re-evaluate safety measures. Each setback reminded her of how fragile her progress was. But instead of collapsing under the frustration, she pushed forward. One evening, after the volunteers had gone home, Claire stood alone in the grand hallway. Dust still clung to the air, but patches of polished wood glimmered under the light. For the first time, she didn't just see decay, she saw possibility. She whispered into the stillness, "We're getting there." The victories were small, but they were real. And with each nail hammered, each window washed, each hallway cleared of debris, Claire felt something in herself repairing too. The whispers of gossip in town no longer haunted her as much. For once, she wasn't defined by her divorce or by pity. She was becoming something else, a woman who refused to quit. As she locked the doors and stepped out into the cool night, she realized that the estate was no longer just a burden. It was a mirror of her own resilience, battered, flawed, but still standing. And for the first time in a long while, that gave her hope. The estate had begun to shift from ruin to possibility, but progress was painfully slow. Every repaired step revealed 3 more problems. Claire often wondered if she had bitten off more than she could chew, yet each time despair crept close. Something or someone pulled her back from the edge. One crisp autumn afternoon, she and Emily were sorting through a dusty storage room tucked behind the library. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and mildew, and cobwebs stretched across every corner. Piles of crates leaned against the walls, their labels faded to near invisibility. "Feels like we're in some kind of treasure hunt," Emily joked, tugging at a box lid. Claire smiled faintly, though her arms ached from lifting. If the treasure is moldy blankets and broken lamps, then we're winning. Emily rolled her eyes, but her laughter filled the gloomy room. Together, they pried open one crate after another. Stacks of newspapers, cracked dishes, yellowed curtains. Then Emily's voice rose sharply. "Mom!" "Look at this." Claire turned to see her daughter kneeling beside a trunk half buried under a tarp. The brass lock was tarnished but unlatched. Emily pushed it open, revealing layers of neatly folded cloth. Claire lifted the fabric and gasped. Beneath it were stacks of papers tied with ribbon, alongside several objects wrapped carefully in linen. Her hands trembling, she unwrapped one bundle. Inside lay a gilded frame holding a painting of the estate, as it must have looked decades ago, the gardens in full bloom. Another bundle revealed a set of letters sealed with wax, still intact. And then, beneath them, they uncovered something even more unexpected. Ledgers documenting antique furniture, jewelry, and valuables Raymond had catalogued meticulously. "Mom," Emily whispered, her eyes wide. "Is this worth anything?" Claire swallowed hard. It could be. The next day, she brought a few of the items to an appraiser in Indianapolis. The man's eyes widened the moment he saw the ledgers and the painting. "These are incredible," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Your uncle preserved records of items that collectors would pay handsomely for. Some of this furniture alone, if still intact, could fetch thousands. And these letters, they might hold historical value." Claire sat in stunned silence. For weeks, she had wrestled with the crushing weight of impossible costs. Now, here was a door she hadn't even considered, a way to not only pay off debts but also restore the estate without drowning in despair. When she returned home, Emily was waiting eagerly on the porch. "Well?" Claire couldn't stop the smile that spread across her face. "It's real. They're valuable, more than I ever imagined." Emily squealed, throwing her arms around her mother. "I told you this place had secrets. It's like he left us clues on purpose." Claire hugged her daughter tightly, her eyes stinging with tears. For the first time since the inheritance had turned her world upside down, hope outweighed fear. That evening, she spread the ledgers across the kitchen table, tracing the careful handwriting with her fingers. Raymond, the uncle she barely knew, had hidden so much. His journals had spoken of regret, but these records suggested foresight too, as though he had wanted the estate to be preserved, not erased. Claire whispered into the quiet room, "Maybe you knew I'd find this. Maybe this was your way of giving me a fighting chance." For the first time, she felt not just the burden of her uncle's legacy, but his silent partnership. She didn't fool herself into thinking the road ahead would be easy. There were still taxes, repairs, and skeptics at every corner. But now she had proof that the estate wasn't just a decaying shell. It held tangible value, enough to transform the impossible into something within reach. And that discovery lit a fire in her that no amount of gossip or doubt could extinguish. Winter crept slowly into Indiana, but the estate no longer looked like a forgotten ruin. Bit by bit, through donations, small fundraisers, and the sale of a few antiques discovered in the trunk, Claire had managed to cover urgent repairs. The roof had been patched, the driveway cleared, and the library restored enough to host visitors. The first event was modest, a book club meeting organized by Mrs. Walker. Folding chairs lined the freshly cleaned library, and neighbors who had once scoffed at Claire's inheritance now wandered the aisles with curious smiles. The air carried the faint scent of wood polish and coffee brewed in a borrowed urn. Emily darted between guests, her excitement contagious. "See, Mum." "I told you people would come." Claire, standing near the fireplace with a tray of cookies, felt her throat tighten. The laughter and chatter filled the once empty mansion, and for the first time, it didn't feel haunted. It felt alive. Over the following weeks, more events followed. The art teacher from the high school arranged an exhibit of student paintings in the grand hallway. The local church group hosted a small Christmas concert, carols echoing through the rooms. Even the Historical Society expressed interest in organizing tours, fascinated by the estate's journals and preserved artifacts. Claire watched it all unfold with a mixture of disbelief and pride. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was building something. And the town, once divided, seemed to lean cautiously in her favor. But not everyone was pleased. One frosty morning, David appeared at her door. His breath puffed white in the air, his eyes scanning the improved grounds. "You've really made something of this place," he said, his tone laced with surprise and something darker, regret. Claire crossed her arms. "What do you want, David?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Just came to see. Everyone's talking about it. Guess I underestimated you." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't rise to his bait. "You always did." For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken history. Finally, David muttered, "Well, good luck, Claire," before walking back to his car. As she watched him leave, she realized his opinion no longer held the power it once did. The bitterness that had followed her since the divorce loosened its grip. She didn't need his validation. She had already proven herself. Later that week, Mark Reynolds visited to review new property documents. Standing in the library, he looked around with genuine admiration. "You've come a long way," he said. Claire smiled faintly. "Not just me. The community helped. Emily, too. I couldn't have done it alone." Mark's eyes lingered on her, steady and kind. "Still, it takes someone to lead. You turned ridicule into hope. That's not small." Her cheeks warmed at his words, though she quickly looked away, busying herself with stacking papers. She wasn't ready to think about what might be growing between them, but the thought lingered, quiet and undeniable. On Christmas Eve, Claire and Emily stood together on the porch, watching the lights strung across the estate glow against the snow. Laughter drifted from inside, where neighbors gathered for hot chocolate and carols. Emily slipped her arm through her mother's. "You did it, Mom." "You really did." Claire rested her head lightly against her daughter's. "No, Em, we did." As the snow fell softly around them, Claire felt something she hadn't in years. Peace. The estate was no longer a symbol of burden, but of rebirth. She had taken what others mocked and turned it into something worth protecting. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, she welcomed it. Spring arrived with the scent of new beginnings. The estate, once draped in silence and decay, now breathed with life. Flowers bloomed where weeds had choked the soil, the roof stood strong after repairs, and the once empty hallways rang with footsteps and laughter. Claire often paused to take it all in, marveling at how far she and Emily had come. The grand opening of the estate as a community centre marked the culmination of months of work. Neighbours streamed in, some carrying casseroles, others snapping photos of the restored architecture. Children darted through the halls, their voices echoing like music. For the first time, Claire didn't feel like the subject of whispers. She was part of the town's pride. Standing by the library doorway, she watched Emily give a tour to her friends. The girl's voice carried a confidence Claire hadn't seen before. Emily wasn't just a bystander. She had grown with the house, finding strength in the restoration just as her mother had. Mrs. Walker approached, beaming. "Claire, this is extraordinary. You've given this town something to believe in again." Claire's throat tightened, but she managed a smile. "It wasn't just me. Everyone had a hand in it." "True," Mrs. Walker replied, "but you lit the spark. That matters." As the evening wore on, Claire found herself on the porch, taking in the golden sunset over the fields. Mark Reynolds joined her, his hands tucked in his pockets. "You've done something remarkable," he said quietly. Claire exhaled, a mixture of relief and disbelief. "I almost gave it all up. If it hadn't been for Emily and for you pushing me not to run, I don't think I'd be standing here." Mark smiled, his gaze steady. "Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to face the storm." "You did that." Claire felt warmth rise in her chest, though she didn't reply right away. She had grown used to standing on her own, yet she couldn't deny the comfort of knowing she had allies, friends who had believed when she couldn't. Later that night, after the last guests left, Claire and Emily wandered the estate together. They paused in the library, the journals still neatly stacked on the shelf. Claire ran her fingers over their spines, her heart soft. Emily tilted her head. "Do you think Uncle Raymond would be proud?" Claire considered the question, remembering the man's sorrowful words written decades ago. "I think he'd be relieved, maybe even grateful." His story didn't have a happy ending, but ours isn't over yet. Emily smiled, slipping her hand into her mother's. I'm glad we didn't give up. Me too, Claire whispered. As they stood there, the silence of the estate no longer felt heavy. It felt full, as though the walls themselves had been waiting for laughter to return. For Claire, the inheritance had begun as a cruel joke, a weight she hadn't asked for. But through trial, doubt, and the courage to keep going, it had transformed into something more, a testament to resilience, to second chances, to the power of refusing to let others write your story. The town that once mocked her now respected her. The daughter who once feared losing her mother's spark now saw her as a role model. And Claire herself, once defined by divorce and disappointment, now stood as proof that even from ruins, something beautiful could rise. Before we close this chapter, remember to subscribe for more powerful stories of resilience and transformation. And if you're ready for the next journey, click on the video waiting for you right here. You won't want to miss it. Claire turned off the lights one by one, the mansion glowing faintly in the night. She paused at the front door, looking out at the driveway that once felt like the path to nowhere. Now it led to everything she hadn't known she was capable of. And with a deep, steady breath, she stepped forward into the life she had built from the ashes of doubt.